Hey everybody. Well, I'm outside my backyard enjoying a relatively cool morning in what looks like it's going to be remembered as the coolest summer on average for the world for the rest of my life and for the rest of my children's lives. There's so much happening, it's hard to know where to start. Yesterday, on August 1st, the former president of the United States was indicted on an additional set of federal charges that stem from his effort to overthrow the constitutional order a couple of years ago on January 6th. Naturally, at times like this, my thoughts turn to Niger and to the war of Russia against Ukraine, right? I promise, actually, all of these things, the climate crisis, the political crisis in the United States, what's happening in Niger and other countries in Western Africa, and what's happening in Ukraine, they're more closely related than they might seem at first glance. To help clarify what I'm thinking, I actually want to turn to another historian. Heather Cox Richardson is at Boston College in Massachusetts, and she is a powerhouse, one of the finest public intellectuals that we have in the United States today. If you are not following her very near daily posts on Facebook or getting them in your inbox via Substack, then you are really missing out. She brings a historian's eye, a historian's training to an analysis of the news. She aggregates current events as only such a well-trained mind can do, and puts them in the context of U.S. political and economic and social and intellectual and religious history, and attempts to draw connections across time and across geography around the world. It is really spectacular and a noble, sacrificial effort to help promote and shore up American participatory democracy. So Heather Cox Richardson, July 28th, last Friday, posted about the military takeover of the government in Niger. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Niger, or let me read some of Dr. Richardson's post. And I may put in some editorial comments along the way. On Wednesday, soldiers of the Presidential Guard overthrew Niger's democratically elected president Mohamed Bazoum and replaced him with a military general, Abdurrahman Chiani. Niger gained independence from France in 1960, and after a series of upheavals, the country established its current democracy in 2011. Bazoum was the first elected leader since then to succeed another in a peaceful democratic transfer of power. Niger is a key player in the struggle to establish democracy in Africa, and Bazoum's overthrow is part of that larger story. Niger is a landlocked country about twice the size of Texas, in the center of the Sahel region in Africa, a dry grassland that crosses the continent from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, below the Sahara and above the tropical grassland region called the Sudan. That region is being hit terribly hard by climate change, as temperatures are rising faster there than anywhere else in the world, making the desert push into the grasslands. The United Nations estimates that Niger loses almost 250,000 acres of arable land each year. Just to make sure, if you're not looking at a map, Niger is landlocked. It sits just to the north of Nigeria. Both of them are named for the mighty Niger River, which flows through both and empties into the Atlantic Ocean. The biggest ethnic group in Niger is the Hausa people, who also live in northern Nigeria across the border. The other big ethnic group in Niger is the Fulani or Fulbe people. Because agriculture has for a long time been kind of sketchy, there's a lot of pastoralism in this region, and that traditionally is the main occupation of the Fulbe people. This region has also been plagued by violent Islamic groups, and strongmen promising to restore order have launched successful coups in the countries of Mali and Burkina Faso, which are Niger's neighbors. And then Richardson adds, when Vice President Kamala Harris went to Ghana in March, her visit was partly to shore up democracy in that country, which is on the edge of the Sahel region and under pressure from militants in Sahel countries. I'll just say as well that this pressure from Islamic militant groups is not brand new. Islam has been a presence in this region for hundreds of years. In the 1700s, early 1800s in particular, Islamic revolutions in this area were about good standards of governance and were about opposition to the international slave trade in a certain sense. So Islam has a history of being a unifying and a progressive force in this region. Most recently, though, in the wake of the U.S. war in Iraq and its unintended consequences around the Middle East and elsewhere, groups that are associated with ISIS and Al-Qaeda have found space in these countries of the Sahel and elsewhere in Africa, and waged really horrible campaigns of violence, overthrowing governments. While Niger's people are some of the poorest in the world, the country's resources are immensely valuable. Niger has oil and, more strikingly, produces 7% of all the uranium in the world. It also has the fastest population growth in the world, with more than half the population under 15. Noting that young people are vulnerable to radicalization, the U.S. last year said that helping Niger to become an increasingly capable partner against regional threats is a critical goal. I will also add that climate change is a part of the mix in what makes Niger and other countries vulnerable to radicalization. These are among the people of the world who have contributed the least in terms of global emissions, the pollution that is causing global temperature rises, and yet they are suffering among the very worst consequences. Nigerian forces have worked alongside France and the U.S. to combat Islamic terrorism in the region, and both France and the U.S. have troops stationed in Niger, France about 1,500, the U.S. about 1,100. In 2022, the U.S. State Department described Niger as a strategically important, as a linchpin for stability in the Sahel, as well as a reliable counterterrorism partner against ISIS, Boko Haram, and other regional violent extremist organizations. In March, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Niger, where he announced a $150 million humanitarian aid package to the Sahel region, bringing the year's total aid from the U.S. to $233 million. Niger is a young democracy in a challenging part of the world, Blinken told reporters, but it remains true to the values we share. Niger has been quick to defend the democratic values under threat in neighboring countries. I just want to underline those numbers again. In March, our Secretary of State visited Niger, where he announced a $150 million humanitarian aid package to the Sahel region, not just to Niger, but to the entire region, bringing the year's total aid from the U.S. to $233 million. I mean, that is a once-a-day accounting error for the United States government and for many of our largest corporations and wealthiest individuals. I have to say I would have been embarrassed to show up in Niger with only $150 million in my pocket. If it's that important, then we need to show that that's the case.